Hi and welcome to this webinar about internationalization. My name is Kim and here with me I have my colleague.
Yeah, hello, I'm Peter.
So today we're going to talk about how to localize Vaadin applications.
Yeah.
So let's start off a little bit about the basics.
Yes.
So what does localizing a Vaadin application actually mean? So there are a few obvious things. So when you have an application that you want to use in multiple different languages, you obviously need to update the captions.
Yeah.
So whatever texts that you see in your application. So here we have an example that you have an application in Spanish or in English.
Yeah.
But there are other things that you need to take into account than just text. So for example, sums are something that's quite typical that you need to localize. So
Yeah.
for example, you need to take into account currencies and you need to take into account the actual format of the sums. So here in Finland we use a comma as the decimal separator and then a space as the thousand separator, while as in the US they use the comma as a thousand separator and then a dot as a decimal separator.
Yes.
Another thing that is quite often confusing is dates. So here in Finland we like to use two different formats. We use one where we have the day of month as first, then a dot, the month, dot, year, or then in some cases we use the year dash month dash day of month, while in US you typically see dates formatted as the month backslash day of month backslash the year.
Yeah.
So when we think about a Vaadin application, so here we have an example of the dashboard demo. So even in this simple application we can see multiple different things that we need to take into account when we want to localize something. So we need to localize the captions for the components. So for example here we have the create report button that has a caption. Then we have different kind of labels. So for example the header for this view, we have a table in this view which has column headers, and those column headers need to be localized, and then the actual content in the table, in this case a date, needs to be localized. But there are other things that we also need to take into account. For example, in forms we typically have some kind of validation messages. So if we apply a Vaadin validator to a field, you get a default validation message, but if you localize your application, let's say to Finnish, then you need to also change that validation message so that it's in Finnish and not in English.
Yeah.
Then there is a little bit more tricky thing to localize, and that's the system messages. So it's this kind of error messages that you see that when something goes wrong with the system. So it might be that you get a communication problem, which means that the browser has lost its connection with the server. And then you will see this communication problem error message that has a little bit of information of what happened. And this is also something that you need to localize, but these are a little bit more tricky to localize than the rest of the application.
Yeah, and that's right. This is because these messages are kind of static. They are sent to the UI at the first request. And you can localize them if you override and provide your custom system messages provider. It will actually get a locale that you can use when you specify these messages, but this locale cannot be changed after the application has been initialized. So for example, in this demo app that I have here, my browser is now set to Finnish. So if I now kill my server, you will see that this is actually the Finnish translation that I specified that's being used for system messages. And even if I were to change the language of this UI to something else, it would still be in Finnish because that's the first locale that our servlet received from the browser.
So in general, when we talk about making a translation of a Vaadin application and how you actually technically implement it, the approach is somewhat similar than localizing some other application built with Java. So for example, it's quite similar to localizing a Swing application.
Yep,
but Vaadin does provide some helpers for us, and one of the helpers is set locale. So
Yes.
Petro, could you please elaborate on that one?
The set locale method is something that's available in all our Vaadin components, including the UI. And depending on whether the component is localized or not, this locale might make no sense at all, or it might make a lot of sense. So to demonstrate this, we can go here to our date picker. This is the Vaadin sampler. You can see here we have a calendar, a date picker. The locale is set to United States. The month name is in English. The week names are also in English. The week starts on Sunday, and we have a 12-hour clock. If we now were to change this to, for example, United Kingdom, we still have English as the language, of course, but the week now starts on Monday, and we have a 24-hour clock. And finally, if I change this to something completely else, like Swedish, then you can see that now we have the Swedish names for the weekdays as well. And this doesn't only apply to date pickers, it also applies to, for example, text fields. In this case, I have a text field which has a big decimal converter. That's a locale specific. And as you can see here, this is quite a large number. We have spaces as 1,000 separators, and we have a comma as the decimal point. If I change this to English, that looks completely different. Now all of a sudden our commas are used as 1,000 separators, and we have a single dot as the decimal separator. There is one point I'd like to make here. It doesn't really have anything to do with localization, but with the usability in general. And this is if your UI supports multiple languages. For example, here we support English, Finnish, and Swedish. And if the user accidentally forgets how to enter these decimals, it can have some strange side effects. So for example, if I were to I want to enter 1.50 in this field, and this is how we do that in Finnish. But since this is an English locale, it interprets that comma as 1,000 separators and converts the number to 150. So this is something you need to be aware of when you're localizing your applications. And if this is the intended behavior, then that's fine. If you want to support both commas and dots as decimal points, then you will need to code that yourself.
Yeah, so what happens if I put a 1.50 in the Finnish locale?
Let's see what happens. 1.50, and I will get a validation error, which in this case is actually translated to Finnish.
Yeah. So this is the basic idea of using set locale, but a question that we need to think about is how do I actually choose the language in which I want to use the application? So yes. We're going to talk about 3 different approaches for actually selecting the language and then how you localize the application. So
yeah, that's right. So the first one is maybe the easiest one. We set the language before our application is initialized, so we actually know the locale when we invoke UI.init. And we can get these locales in many different ways. We can get it from the browser details. This is something that Vaadin has built-in support for, and our example application also uses this. You could analyze the host, use host mask. You could access the session or the request or a cookie.
Yeah, if it happens to have something stored.
Yeah, if you have something stored there. For example, you might have a third-party authentication system that sets a cookie or sets a session attribute for you, and then you could read the locale from there. So that's one way of doing it, and that would basically mean that this locale is then fixed for the remainder of the session. So whatever locale is selected when the application is initialized, that's what the user will be using until he or she logs out.
Yeah, so basically all the labels, captions, whatever you have in the application, they will all use this locale in the application.
Yeah. Then there's another way. User selects the language on the login page, and the login page in this case would be a Vaadin page that we've implemented. And version where it's slightly more advanced, where the user selects the language on the login page, and the login page in this case would be a Vaadin page. that we've implemented and set as the UI content. And you could probably have some kind of username, password field. Then you could have a language selector, which could be a combo box. It could be buttons for selecting the language. And here you would have to add some logic to actually translate the login screen when the user changes the language. But once the language has been changed and you're sort of navigated into the main view, that locale is then used for the remainder of the session.
Yeah, so we get a little bit overhead for implementing fly.
Yeah, but only under one view.
Yeah, only in the one view, and then in the rest of the application, you just use that same locale all over the place, and you do not need to take care of a login view or whatever the first view is that you use in the application.
Yes.
There you have to take into account that we change the language on the fly.
Yeah, but only under one view.
Yeah, only in the one view, and then in the rest of the application, you just use that same locale all over the place, and you do not need to take care of actually changing the language.
Yes.
But this approach is not always sufficient.
No.
We might have use cases where we need to change the language on the fly. May I point out that this so-called login approach, it's enough for most use cases.
Yeah.
There are, of course, use cases where we need to change the language on the fly. For example, we don't have a login page in the Vaadin application, so the user has immediately access to multiple different views in the application. He or she can navigate in the application back and forth, and then at some point change the language.
Yeah, so regardless of where exactly in the application the user is, it should be possible to change the language. And this is how our demo application is actually working. As you can see, I can change this language on the fly without reloading, without doing anything else. And this is a bit tricky, because even though we can actually set the locale on the UI level, it doesn't notify the components that the locale has changed. So this is something we have to do ourselves. And we're going to show you one approach here. We've used it in many production projects, and it works really well, and it's not that hard to implement. And it actually starts with an interface. We call it translatable, but you can call it whatever you want. And this interface defines a single method, this update message strings, and this is basically invoked whenever the language has changed and the UI needs to be updated with new captions, new error messages, new icons, and so on. And the way you'd use this interface is that for all your components or views that you're writing that are localization aware, they implement this translatable interface, and they implement this update message strings method. And inside this method you would then set any captions, you would update the locale fields of any date fields, etc., etc. So as you can see in the example, we're actually not specifying any captions when we create the fields. We have the default constructors there. Instead, we set the captions inside of this method.
Yeah, and actually, if I may note one thing about this implementation, is that note that the translatable interface is implemented by the view and not by the components directly. So, for example, we have a text field that has a localized caption, but it's not the text field that implements the translatable interface. It's the view that actually uses the text field.
Yeah.
And this should be enough in most cases. Of course, if you have one component that's reused in many places and uses the same translation, then it might make sense to extend the component and then implement the translatable interface directly in that component.
Yeah.
But in most cases, you should just implement it directly in the view.
Yeah. Alright, so now we have the view implemented and ready, but we still don't have the code that actually invokes this update message strings method. And the way we use it is by defining a recursive method on the UI level. So in this case, we have this update message strings method that accepts a Vaadin component as a parameter. This method consists of two parts. The first part checks whether this component actually implements the translatable interface, and if it does, it will invoke this update message string to actually update the UI. And the second part is to check if this component also contains other components. So this implements the has components interface. And if it does, we will recursively invoke this update message strings method on each child message. And by doing this, it will traverse the entire component tree until all the attached components have been translated.
Yeah. One downside, so what happens with views that are not in the component tree? So for example, we might have a view that's cached within the navigator, but then it's not in the current component tree.
That's a good question. If the component is not attached to a UI, then it will obviously not receive this notification and it will not update itself. But just a quick fix for that is to override the attach method of your component and invoke the update message strings method over there instead. That way you will ensure that your UI views will always be up to date whenever they are attached to the UI.
Yeah, so basically it's not enough, for example, to invoke the update message strings in the constructor, because the constructor is not invoked. If you already once created an instance of the view and then have it cached within the navigator and then re-navigate to the same view and reuse the same instance, then if the language has changed between the usage of the view, then you need to update the strings when it's attached to the component tree.
And if you're getting the local information from the UI, then you would get a null pointer exception in the constructor since it's not attached to the UI yet. So that's another reason why you shouldn't invoke it in the constructor.
Yeah, so one of the things with this approach is that we actually have the localization logic within the view, and some might think that that's a bad idea, that you'd like to use, for example, just some message keys that are then automatically replaced. But the problem with that approach is that sometimes we have localized messages that are dependent on some UI logic. So for example, in Petter's example application, down there in the bottom of the view, we can see a message that has a parameter, and actually the message is a little bit dependent on the actual logic in the view.
Yeah, that's right. So as you can see, it basically, this little caption here displays the number of rows in this table. And as you can see, this number 43, it's in all language versions, and it also changes when the number of rows changes. And here we even have support for the singular version, so there is one message in the table, whereas now there are 44 messages in the table. And this is also taken into account in all the language versions, so the Finnish and Swedish translations also have this singular plural form.
Yeah, and now when we have actually a parameter to the message, if we would have an approach where we want to automatically just replace some keys with the actual localized string, having these parameters can be quite tricky. So now when we actually set the localized messages within the view knows what kind of data it has and what kind of logic we have there, and how we should take into account.
Yeah, so we have full control over the translation of the UI. And the way we actually do this in this case is by using parameterized messages. This is a standard Java feature. It's used in internationalized Java applications. It's not just some Vaadin thingy. In our example application, we have a message bundle which contains 2 lines like this. And the message count caption single contains the singular version, and the message count caption multiple contains the plural version. And as you can see, there is this 0 parameter, which will then get replaced by this number of rows in the table. And the way we actually do this in code is that we use the message format. This is a standard Java class. We create a new instance of the message format. We pass in the pattern. The pattern in this case would be this message string. And then we pass in a locale as well, because we can actually have some special types, for example, dates, numbers can also have local specific formatting inside their parameters. And then we invoke the format method and we pass in an array of arguments, and the first element in this array will be placed on this 0 parameter, second element will be placed on the 1 parameter, and so on. So this means that in different translations we can have the different parameters in different places depending on how the language is constructed without actually having to change the code.
Yeah. So where should we then store these translated messages? There are different kind of approaches.
Yeah. I think the most common one in the Java world is Java resource bundles. This is again something that's built into Java, and that's what we use in our demo application as well. And but you could also use XML files, you could use databases, you could use web services. It doesn't really matter because this is all standard Java, server-side Java. We can use whatever we want. Java resource bundles, probably the easiest way to get started. This is mostly based on properties files. I think you can use XML files as well. The properties files are named in a certain way. As you can see, it consists of 3 parts. We got the first part, in this case messages. That would be the base name of the bundle. The second part is the language, and the final part is the country. And both the language and the country parts are optional. So for example, if it doesn't matter which country you happen to speak Finnish in, you can just use FI for the Finnish language. And when you invoke this code, you use the getBundle static method of the resource bundle class, and you pass in only the base name of the bundle. And Java will then resolve, find the correct file based on the locale you specified. And for example, if the locale we specify is not translated, then it will default to just messages.properties. So we could always have the sort of default language without any language or country information, and then the translations would then have their own language and country suffixes. One final note when using these resource bundles, that's the encoding, because by default Java assumes that the resource bundles are in ISO 88591 encoding. And if that works for your language, then it's really easy. You just go ahead and use them. But it might be a problem if you want to use other alphabets. For example, you're creating a Russian or a Chinese or an Arabic UI. Then you will probably want to go with Unicode. And for me personally, I'd recommend you always use Unicode for everything, because your life gets a lot easier that way. You won't get error reports from users complaining about strange characters in their UIs. Unfortunately, for some strange reason, it's easier said than done to switch to Unicode when it comes to resource bundles. You will have to do some hacking to get Java to actually use, for example, Unicode when reading these properties files into resource bundles. And we've actually done this hacking for you, so you can go to our example on the GitHub. There you will find this application that we just showed to you. And there's also an example of how to force Java to use a Unicode when reading resource bundles. It also contains an example of translating the system messages and of course this approach that we just explained to you about changing the language on the fly. And you could do whatever you want with this code.
So in conclusion, to actually localize the Vaadin application, it's quite simple. There are different simple approaches you can take. The most important thing is to actually remember to do it. So
yeah.
You have to take care that you actually implement that interface and do it manually. But it's not that much of a hassle in the end.
No, and it's a good thing to take into account when you actually start to design your application. So if you know you're going to need multiple language support, it's easier if you actually build it in from scratch.
Yeah.
It's not that hard to add it afterwards, but it's a lot easier if you build it from scratch.
Yeah, and as Petr mentioned, the code that we've been using, the example application, it's all freely available on GitHub, and we'll post the link to you so that you can check it out.
Yeah.
So this was all that we had. We thank you for your time and hope you have enjoyed the webinar.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.